this whole idea that Priti Patel said, look, there's 8.5 million economically inactive people, as in trying to instill in the public that, look, there's all these British people that are lying around doing nothing. Now, in the show earlier on, we did discuss that 8.5 million figure is slightly misleading. The real figure perhaps is closer to 2 million. But explain to us why this whole idea of, hang on, you've got a lot of vacancies. You've got 100,000 or so in the NHS. You've got hundreds of thousands in the social care industry. We've got roughly 2 million people laying around. Job done. Those people, fill those jobs. We don't need immigration. Why is that logic flawed?
It's the same logic as it's the economic equivalent of the Flat Earth Society. It appears to match, but the reason that it doesn't is that if you look at the areas where EU nationals have come to work in the UK population, they're a top-up. They're a top-up where we've reached the natural limit of what we can do with the domestic population. So let's take social care as an example, which the Migration Advisory Committee flagged was a key area of shortages. 84% of the people who work in social care are British. That's about as many people as you can persuade to work in those extremely arduous and low-paid occupations. And in social care, the National Audit Office reported they've got a 6.6% vacancy rate. Now, we've only managed to persuade about 250,000 EU nationals, sorry, 250,000 migrants to work in social care. Only half of those are EU nationals. So it's a tiny number that migrants are topping up. But we've reached the natural limit of who can provide that labour. In the agricultural field, the NFU have said that they need at least 70,000 seasonal agricultural workers. The government's promising them 2,500. It doesn't add up. And the reason it doesn't add up is because the domestic population are already in work. They're not going to leave the higher paid, high skilled jobs to move down the ladder to do lower paid, low skilled jobs. And the particular problem will be in hospitality. KPMG have predicted by 2029 we would have a shortfall of 1 million workers in hospitality. And that's why if your domestic population at working age is not growing fast enough, that's why a migration policy of this sort is going to cause inevitably economic decline, because industry won't be able to expand and recruit at the rate which they would naturally need to grow when demand increases. So it's plain as a pikestaff. If you limit the potential for growth, then your economy overall is going to be poorer. Now you can say that people who had xenophobic opinions are happy to be poor, but I think what we're seeing is the administration of a toxic shock to the economy, because it's all going to happen too quickly come January. And the Tier 2 scheme, currently 31,000 employers, just cannot scale up in time. It takes 2 to 3 months even to be granted a Tier 2 sponsorship license as an employer. How on earth they think they're going to magic into existence Tier 2 sponsors by the end of the year? It's just not feasible. And employers, if they can't source that labour, they will just choose either to mechanise or not to expand at all. Or worse still, they'll expand elsewhere in Europe, and they'll simply move to areas of the EU where they can get access to the same labour.
We are also talking about the election of the deputy leader. Can I ask your opinion on something that one of the Labour deputy leader candidates put out on her Twitter feed yesterday? Dawn Butler says an MP who publicly undermines the leader should be suspended. The party needs to unite and it needs discipline. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't often comment on my colleagues' tweets, but I felt compelled to on that occasion because I thought that was a pretty unhelpful thing to say, frankly. We live in a free society. We have a democratic system. We have a democratic party. People are entitled to voice their opinions. I would agree that possibly over the last 3 or 4 years, there have been too many Labour MPs who've spoken out and undermined the leadership too often. But I think that is something that we have to accept as part of the territory. And if we start trying to crack down on dissenting voices, we'll be going down a very slippery slope. And indeed, Jeremy Corbyn is the perfect example of someone who spoke up vociferously and regularly against whoever the Labour leader was in the
Yes.
past. So I think it's not something that will get much traction. I think it's probably a symptom of the fact that there are 5 deputy leadership candidates, all vying for attention. And with the leadership contest going on at the same time, it's quite difficult to sort of get that much media interest. So I think sometimes people probably say things that are designed to catch the eye, so to speak, and that may be one of them.
Also, want to get your thoughts on, this period of the Labour leadership, particularly after the what was quite a crushing defeat in December. Labour was supposed to go into a period of self-reflection to find out exactly what had gone wrong. I know that there is a commissioned sort of study on what has gone wrong with Labour, because James Meadway, who's part of the panel, was on the show a couple of weeks back. But this study is not going to be published until after the ballot papers go out. Do you think that's a sort of almost like an own goal? If you're going to ask people to vote for a new candidate, don't you want to have that report out to show what went wrong last time?
Well, I think one of the issues with the current leadership contest has been that there's been probably too much proximity to the recent election result. Obviously, 2 of the 3 candidates were part of the shadow cabinet. I think that they have not been as challenging as I would have liked on where it went wrong. I think that actually the period of reflection and the need for us to renew are going to take a couple of years, and possibly a leadership contest bound up in personalities isn't necessarily the best way to do it. But I think whoever does win has to take whatever findings come through seriously. Otherwise, we are going to see the same again. But I do think that the contest hasn't really articulated, other than through Lisa herself, why we've lost actually now 4 elections in a row.
But here's the question that I think most listeners will be wondering about. If you know about these schemes and how they're being mishandled, and we're talking about tax avoidance, and the HMRC knows about them because they created them, why don't they just close those loopholes?
Well, so that's where I think a lot of the confusion lies, because people will say, okay, tax avoidance is legal and therefore it's allowed. And when you say something is legal, it gives it the kind of impression that this is almost, permitted by law, right? That's what people say.
Yeah.
But the reality is that courts, judges, judges can take the view that something is not the intention of the law.
Yeah.
And make a judgment which strikes out the effect of that tax avoidance scheme. So HMRC can take, going back to the banker's bonus example, right, with the share scheme, that actually happened. So HMRC then took, it was Deutsche Bank and UBS to court. It ended up in the Supreme Court. And what Deutsche Bank and UBS argued was that all of these schemes had met all of the tests in the very detailed and specific anti-avoidance legislation, and therefore could not be considered to be tax avoidance. And the Supreme Court said, no, it's clearly not the intention of the government for you to do what you're doing, and therefore we're going to reverse what you're doing and we're going to tax it. And so you get to these situations where companies and businesses are trying it on, or their advisors as well, and it goes to court, and it's kind of a civil matter where HMRC and the business come to an agreement saying, actually, that didn't work, so we have to tax it. I think it's very difficult to describe that as perfectly legal in the way that the public would think is perfectly legal, right? When you say to somebody, that's perfectly legal, they go away and they think, okay, this means I can do it and I will face no consequence.
Right.
That's not true. And the way that the legal profession, I have to say, has been in the tax field, has been, well, problematic is one way to describe it. It's not a very good way to describe it, but it's dangerous for this idea to be out there that tax avoidance schemes are legal, because people then do them 15, 20 years down the line. They find out that their legal advisor was wrong, and they find out they get a tax bill of 10, 20, 30, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds. They can be ruined.
How far back can you be? I thought it was 6, 7 years.
Well, it's 6 years, a normal course of business. But if it's thought that you took deliberate attempts to conceal your tax position or what you were doing, then it can be up to 20.
Wow.
What you did 20 years ago, people have forgotten entirely. When I think my point I'm trying to make, is that when lawyers and legal advisors tell their clients that something is perfectly legal, I think there's a very heavy burden of responsibility to them to make sure that what they're talking about is something which is kind of bulletproof and entirely in line with the theory and the purpose and the intent of the law. Otherwise, people could end up getting huge amounts of trouble because they, in good faith, have taken advice and they're not experts themselves. And in the end, it's not the lawyers who are going to have to end up paying for it. They're long gone.
If I told you about fraud, what do people get really upset about? And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, gosh, we spent so much time thinking about benefits fraud. That's the thing that people get really upset about. Health tourism as well. But benefits fraud and benefit fraud, I just looked it up. And again, there's various figures, but they are nothing compared to the tax gap. So all these people shouting about benefits fraud and this vilification of people who have to rely on the benefit system, with this assumption that if you have more than one child and you're on benefits, you're somehow defrauding the taxpayer, to the tune of the highest figure I can find is a 4 billion. But actually, it's not quite clear whether that is overpayments. But fraud in itself is 1.2 billion plus tax credit fraud of 308 million. So again, let's call it 2 billion. It's nothing. It's a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to the tax gap. And I wonder how many of those people who complain about benefits fraud, and again, I'm not condoning benefits fraud, by the way, it shouldn't happen. No fraud should happen. Shouldn't be defrauding the taxpayer. But why are people more upset about benefits fraud than they are about the tax gap? And perhaps it is because quite a lot of people are part of the tax gap problem. Quite a lot of people have accepted to pay for a cash job or charge the cash job, which is a version of fraud, of tax fraud.